We don't always notice the moment a family decides who gets to need and who doesn't. Sometimes it shows up later, in paperwork, in silence, in the way a room cools when a name is spoken. This story stayed with us because it didn't begin with a fight. It began with an assumption. Miriam Feldman is 31. She works in risk and compliance, lives outside Cambridge, and has spent most of her life being described as fine. This is where she starts. I was already awake when my mother called. Not panicked. Careful. The kind of voice she used when she'd practiced what she was about to say. "Miriam," she said, drawing my name out. "We just wanted to talk." I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the floor. I knew that tone. It usually meant Leah. Growing up, I was the one who didn't cry in public, the one who did her homework without reminders. When teachers called, my parents nodded like this was expected. When Leah struggled, they rearranged the week. I learned early that being easy was the same as being invisible. At dinner that night, my father folded his hands on the table. He talked about family, about responsibility, about how some people were built sturdier than others. My mother watched me the way you watch someone crossing a frozen pond, ready to say stop if it cracked. "We assume you'll understand," she added softly. I didn't answer right away. I could feel something tightening in my chest, familiar and old. Leah kept her eyes on her plate. This was the moment things shifted, though no one raised their voice. Sometimes the silence is the pressure point. That was one of those times. We've heard that pause before. It's the space where someone realizes they've been carrying a role that was never temporary. I told them I needed time. I said it calmly. My hands didn't shake until I was alone again. I've replayed that evening more times than I can count. Not because of what was said, because of what had always been true. Stories like this have a way of continuing long after the call ends. When they do, they tend to find their way into quiet places, and sometimes into shared ones. The next morning, my father sent a follow-up message. Just a line, "Let's talk soon." No rush. There was always rush. Just never for me. At work, I reviewed reports the way I always did. Slow, careful, catching the things other people missed. My manager thanked me in passing, then moved on. I was used to that rhythm. Do the work. Keep things steady. Don't make noise. That night, my parents called again. Leah was on speaker this time. I could hear her breathing, shallow, like she was afraid of taking up too much space. Dad talked about how hard things had been for her lately, how sensitive she was, how life didn't bend easily for everyone. Mom slipped in the familiar line, "You've always landed on your feet." I pressed my thumb into the edge of the couch, not enough to hurt, just enough to feel something solid. Leah finally spoke, quiet, careful. "I don't want anyone upset because of me." No one responded to that. The room went still, even through the phone. That pause stretched longer than the conversation itself. We notice how often the strongest person in the room is expected to absorb the weight without being asked. I told them I wasn't making any decisions yet. My voice sounded even practiced. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen longer than necessary. The kettle screamed itself empty. I forgot to turn it off. This wasn't about one conversation. It never had been. And that was the part I was finally letting myself see. The call from my grandmother came on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice sounded smaller than usual, like she was holding the phone too far from her ear. "The reading is next week," she told me. "I wanted you to hear it from me." I took the day off and drove out a few days later. The room where we gathered smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. Papers were stacked neatly on the dining table, squared like someone had taken their time. The attorney spoke calmly, methodically. Properties, accounts, trusts, everything laid out without drama. When my name came up, I felt my shoulders lift before I could stop it. A separate trust, fully vested, $2,200,000. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't look at Leah. I kept my eyes on the grain in the table, counting the lines until the words settled into something real. Across from me, my father shifted in his chair. The sound was sharp in the quiet. My mother's hand froze halfway to her glass. The attorney moved on. No pause. No emphasis. That's often how the most disruptive information arrives. Plain, unadorned. We've heard rooms change like that before. Not loudly. Just enough that everyone notices the air. Afterward, my grandmother squeezed my hand. A little longer than necessary. "You were always careful," she murmured. "Your grandfather admired that." In the driveway. My parents lingered. No congratulations. No comments at all. On the drive home, my phone buzzed once. "We'll need to talk about this." I didn't respond. I turned the radio off and let the silence ride with me the rest of the way. My parents asked me to come over the following Sunday. No urgency in the message, just an address and a time. Like a dentist appointment you're expected to keep. My mother had already set the table when I arrived. Plates out, napkins folded too neatly. My father waited until we were all seated before speaking. "This isn't a confrontation," he began, palms flat on the wood. "We just want to talk things through." He talked about stability, about trajectories, about how life had a way of rewarding people differently, regardless of effort. His words stacked carefully, like he didn't want one wrong move to send them tumbling. My mother leaned forward, voice softer. "You've always landed on your feet. Miriam, you're resilient." That word again. "She needs more of a buffer," my father added, nodding toward Leah. "We're worried about her." Leah stared at the edge of her plate. She didn't speak. I felt the familiar pressure settle in. The expectation that I would make this easier, that I would nod and absorb it. "You're not asking me to give anything up," I said slowly. "Of course not," my mother replied, too quickly. "We just assumed you'd understand what's best for the family." The room went quiet after that. Not tense, just held. We recognize that pause. It's the moment where a decision has already been made, even if no one says it out loud. I pushed my chair back and stood. My hands were steady, which surprised me. "I need time," I told them. Real time. No one argued. No one stopped me. When I left, my mother hugged me longer than usual. I drove home with the feeling that something had shifted, even though nothing had been agreed to. The invitation said family dinner, which should have been my first warning. My aunt's house was already loud when I arrived. Chairs scraping, glasses clinking, someone laughing too hard at something that wasn't funny. My father stood near the fireplace, hands folded the way he did when he was preparing to teach. He waited until plates were half empty before clearing his throat. "We've been talking," he began, scanning the room, "about how to handle things responsibly, given everyone's needs." My stomach tightened. I hadn't been included in those talks. Not really. He went on about fairness, about flexibility, about how circumstances changed, even when documents didn't. He never mentioned numbers. He didn't have to. "We're considering adjusting how the inheritance is allocated," he said, finally, "just to make sure no one is left vulnerable." Across the table, my cousin looked at me, then away. My aunt's fork paused midair. No one interrupted. I felt heat rise up my neck, slow and unmistakable. This wasn't a conversation. It was a statement. Leah's chair creaked softly as she shifted. "I don't want this to cause problems," she said, barely audible. "If Mom and Dad think this is best, I trust them." That landed harder than anything else. We've seen moments like this, when silence isn't confusion, it's alignment. I stood, careful not to rush it. I wasn't told this would be discussed here. My father met my eyes, calm, almost relieved. "We assumed you'd understand." I nodded once. Not agreement. Recognition. The rest of the evening blurred. Conversations resumed in fragments, like nothing had happened. I left early, coat half buttoned, the cold hitting my face harder than it should have. In the car, My hands shook for the first time, not from anger, from the clarity settling in, heavy and unavoidable. I met the attorney on my lunch break, a small office above a bakery, the smell of bread drifting up the stairs. I noticed that first, how normal it all felt. She listened without interrupting, pen resting against her notebook. When I finished, she nodded once. "They can't reassign your trust," she said, calm, certain. "Any attempt to delay or redirect it without your consent would be a breach." I stared at the window behind her, traffic inching along, someone jaywalking like it was nothing. "If I push back," I said, "they'll say I tore the family apart." She didn't rush to answer. "They may say that either way." Then she added, quieter, "Once you proceed, there's no undo." That sat between us, heavy, final. We've learned that clarity often arrives without comfort. It doesn't raise its voice. It just waits. I walked back to work slower than usual, sat at my desk without logging in. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "We hope you're thinking about what matters." I closed it without replying. That evening, I called the attorney back. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I want to move forward." She asked if I was sure, not gently. Honestly, "Yes," I said. "I am." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen with the lights off. The city hummed outside like it always did. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment, but I knew I'd crossed something, and there was no going back. My grandmother called 2 days later. She didn't waste time. "Come see me," she said. "Your father's been here." Her living room looked the same as always. Lace curtains, a clock that ticked louder than it should. She poured tea with hands that didn't shake. "He thinks I don't know what he's been doing," she said, setting the cup in front of me. "He always did." She told me about a conversation from years ago, how my father had sat in that same chair and talked about Leah's future, about how some children needed more help than others, how my grandfather had listened, then said no. He was very clear. She went on. He wanted fairness, not appearances. My chest tightened. I hadn't known any of this. She reached for a folder on the side table, papers inside. Neat, labeled. "There's a clause," she said. "Anyone who tries to interfere with the trusts loses their authority." I pictured my father's face, the certainty he carried, the way he'd spoken like the decision was already made. We've watched truth surface like this before, not as a confrontation, as a quiet correction. My grandmother met my eyes. "He saw you," she said, even when others didn't. The next week moved quickly. Calls, emails, formal language that left no room for argument. My father was removed as executor. No courtroom, no shouting, just finality. When I told my parents, my mother cried. My father didn't say anything at all. Afterward, I sat alone in my car, hands on the wheel, heart racing in short bursts. For the first time, I wasn't questioning myself. I was standing in something solid, and it held. The fallout wasn't loud. That surprised me. My mother started calling more often, short check-ins, questions about work, weather. Nothing about what happened unless I brought it up. When I did, she went quiet, like she was touching something still hot. My father stopped calling altogether. Leah reached out once, a few weeks later, asked if we could get coffee. She arrived early and kept twisting the paper sleeve on her cup. "I didn't know how to say no to them," she admitted, eyes fixed on the table. "I didn't know how to be anything else." I nodded. It felt like the most honest thing either of us had said in years. We've noticed how distance doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it's the first honest space people have. After that, things settled into a new shape. Family gatherings without my father. Awkward pauses. Fewer expectations. At home. I unpacked boxes I'd left sealed for months. Old notebooks, receipts, proof of a life I'd built quietly. At night, the anxiety came in shorter waves, easier to breathe through. Nothing was fixed, But nothing was being taken from me anymore, and that mattered more than I'd expected. The money arrived quietly. No ceremony. Just a notification and a line of text that said it was complete. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first, burned the toast. Normal things. I paid off what I owed. Set most of it aside. Kept my life the same size. The biggest change was internal. I stayed in therapy. I stopped apologizing for pauses, for not answering right away, for choosing myself without explaining it. I started visiting my grandmother on Sundays. Sometimes we talked about my grandfather. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. One afternoon, she handed me a thin folder she'd kept in a drawer. Inside were copies of things I'd forgotten, acceptance letters, articles, notes in his handwriting. He was proud. She said simply. I drove home with that sitting beside me, lighter than it should have been. Miriam Feldman spent most of her life believing strength meant not needing anything. What I know now is quieter than that. I can need things. I can take up space. I can be seen. Even if the people I wanted most never learned how. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with steadier breathing, with room to grow into yourself. We've listened to many endings like this, the ones that don't announce themselves. They tend to linger the longest,